Good morning. Man, I don't know if it started or not. All right, I think it started by now. Good morning, seventh. It's morning here anyway. I don't know wherever you are, maybe afternoon or evening, but it's morning here. It's about 9. I don't know, 15 or so. I've loaded up with coffee. My heart rate is about what a hummingbird's is now, so we're ready to go today. Um, so we're taking obviously chapter 4, section 3 notes today. You need to write these down. I'm going to go probably too fast for you to write them down from this screen. In fact, I'll probably be shorter than even usual on this video, but I will attach them in Google Classroom. So all you gotta do is click on that and you can have the notes and write them down at your own pace. You do need to write them down though, just like if you were in class, because this is a school day. So yeah, make sure you got them in order. Make sure this is after chapter 4, section 2. Make sure you keep them all legible and organized and all that good stuff that we always talk about. Those people without internet, I gave them a hard copy yesterday. Of course, if they don't have internet, they're not listening anyway, so they're not hearing me talk. But anyway, you should have a piece of paper copy if you asked for one yesterday. But if not, Google Classroom, by the time you see this video, will have the actual slideshow posted in there. It'll also have a form for attendance. The full remote students need to do that. They're used to doing that. If you are an in-person student that's remote today, you don't necessarily have to do that. You should make sure you write your notes down. But if you want to, you can. I don't know what the question is going to be yet. I usually make up a question off the top of my head. They're usually pretty bad, stupid questions, but that's, my old man brain working. As you can see on the title slide there, we're talking about a rivalry between Britain and France. Britain and France they're allies now, but for the few hundred years before now, they've basically been fighting a lot. The 1900s, World War I and II, they were allies. But, 1800s, 1700s, and even before then, they were constantly fighting. Britain, the famous saying was the sun never sets on the British Empire. When they said that, they meant it literally. When it's light in the United States, which was part of the British Empire, as we've been talking about, that's the whole point of what we've been doing. We're leading up to the American Revolution. But when the sun's shining here, it's nighttime in Britain, and they also had lands in Africa and Asia. And so when they said that, they meant it literally. At some place on Earth that is owned by the British, the sun is always shining. Later on, when Napoleon takes over the French Empire, they went to war with Britain a lot. He famously said, when somebody said the sun never set on the British Empire, he would say, because God doesn't trust them in the dark. But that just goes to show how much the French and the British were always fighting, and again, this is the age of imperialism and the age of mercantilism and the age of, if you want other lands, you could take them by force. And so, of course, these two big, powerful, rich, militarily strong at that time countries are going to be two of the leading candidates to be. And then if you have areas that are rich in natural resources, they're both going to be competing for the same areas. And so as the English colonies, then now we're talking about in America. So the 13 colonies, as they grow and grow and grow, west of the Appalachian Mountains and north in what we would, I know if you look at a map, it seems dumb to say, like Ohio being out west. But we did, the land west of the Mississippi River was not American yet. It wasn't until the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson, which we'll get to later in the year, that we had that area. And so a lot of that was still, of course, Native American land, but also some of those parts were controlled by the French, and then sometimes there were Native American lands with French allies there. The coureurs de bois that we talked about in the chapter before, I don't remember which, but the people that were there trapping, and the French and the Native Americans got along a lot better than the British and the Native Americans, or the Americans now, if you want to call them that, the colonists and the Native Americans did. And so basically, if you have this one area and you have two groups inside of them, and they keep growing and growing until they bump up against each other, you're going to have friction or conflict or fighting or whatever word you want to use. And so British fur traders went deep into Ohio country. And like I said, Ohio was what was considered the West back then. You look at a map now, obviously it's not in the West, but that's still why this area in the, eastern half of the United States on this side of the Mississippi River where we live now is still called the Midwest. It was called the West back then before we got, and then now that it's in the middle, that's why it's named that. You look at Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania, whatever, and you call that the Midwest. Well, we're not really by any means, especially when you factor in Hawaii and Alaska in the western part of the United States when you look at a map. But that's not really what's important. And so basically what would happen is the British would build a fort and the French would attack it and defeat it, and they would build their own fort, and the British would regroup, and then they would attack and defeat that French fort, and the French would regroup, and they would attack, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so basically, like I said on the last slide, and as you can understand, the two largest powers in North America are heading for a fight, and it's inevitable. Inevitable is if not already, it's soon going to be a vocab word. It means it's unavoidable. It's inevitable that the sun is going to rise in the east every morning. You're not going to wake up one morning and the sun's going to be coming up from the west side. And, inevitable means it's going to happen no matter what. And so, most of, not all of, there's still some free Native American lands, especially west of the Mississippi. There's still what we would call Texas and California today that we're still under Mexican or Spanish control. Florida was owned by Spain or whatever. Mexico had to fight for its own independence. That's a whole other thing. But there's still parts that are, becoming free parts of Mexico that are still Spanish-controlled parts of Mexico, Spanish-controlled Florida, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, for the areas that we're talking about between the Appalachian Mountain Range and the Atlantic Ocean, the area that we call the 13 colonies, or that were called, it's not like we, it's not our special nickname that we have, but those are basically, and then, west of the Appalachian Mountains, but east of the Mississippi River in that area where we live now, those are either mostly controlled by the British or by the French. Not 100%, but for the most part. And so they're the two largest powers in North America, as it says there, and they're headed for a showdown, a little shooty, stabby. So both the French and the British are trying to recruit Native American tribes to be their allies. And this was, for reasons we've talked about for the first, well, not chapter 1, but in chapter 2 and chapter 3, the Native Americans and the British were not really on good terms. There have been a lot of clashes already and a lot of death already. The French had several Native American allies. However, the British were able to convince some Native American tribes to be their allies. And why is that? Well, it could be for several reasons. Some were on good terms. Some were friendly with Native American tribes. That's fine. Some were also, the Native American tribes were of the idea that we've been through this before. We know the British aren't going to lose. And so once the war is over, we want to be on good terms so our people don't get killed by the British. And so, but for the most part, the Native Americans sided with the French. The French basically, if they took their land, they paid them for them. They, in many cases, just shared the land with them, coexisted, married into their tribes, followed their customs and stuff, and generally just had better relations with them. And so Native Americans, though, often would help the French by raiding British settlements. And the Native Americans are starting to, form groups, strengthen numbers, and all that idea. They were starting to, instead of having small tribes that were easily defeated, starting to group up. And the most famous was the Iroquois Confederacy. You'll see it or hear it pronounced Iroquois sometimes. Either way is fine. But they were one of the ones that I talked about on the last slide that were really had been, they'd seen the British war machine enough times that they were feeling kind of beat down and they weren't really wanting to fight anymore. And so they became British allies, which is a big coup for the British. It was a big get for them because that's a powerful group that could really help them in the fight with the French that pretty much most people realize is coming. Some people in Virginia want to take over the Ohio River Valley. That is what we now call Ohio, of course, but also Kentucky, parts of Illinois, Indiana. Virginia's governor sent a young farmer named George Washington to what's now Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania and basically said, let's build a fort there. And he got there, and the French already had a fort built called Fort Duquesne. And, that might be in the next coming slide. But anyway, he goes there and is like, hey, talks to the French, like, hey, get out. The French are like, no, we're going to take this area. So he goes back to report. He becomes a lieutenant colonel. Real quick, I see that word, colonel. That word is colonel. It's a rank in the military. Mr. Batts, there's no R in that word, and that's not That's a stupid spelling, you might be thinking. And I'm here to tell you that I agree. We all speak English and we all read English, and that is an R, and that's colonel, but it's spelled colonel. Why is it like that? I don't know. Probably an old timey language thing that I don't understand. Nobody puts me in charge of spelling. If they did, I would change the spelling, but understand that that is colonel, and it's spelled colonel, and I can't do anything about it, and I can't change it, and I'm sorry. It's confusing. I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, the French are already building. They were already building Fort Duquesne, and so he builds a fort nearby called Fort Necessity. For reasons you can probably figure out, it was a necessity to build it. And then, even though he was outnumbered, Washington attacked a French scouting party. He got whooped, and this made him a English hero, even though he lost pretty decisively. But he became very famous for being willing to strike the first blow. Like he took the fight to those French, and and some people were like, yeah, but he got his butt kicked, and they were like, oh, we don't care, as long as he showed that he's willing to fight. And so, I don't want to spoil a lot, but George Washington becomes pretty important later. He becomes a pretty famous guy. Sorry for the to spoil everything. And so he became very famous within the British or English or whatever you want to call it, military ranks. Benjamin Franklin writes a plan of like, hey, let's all 13 colonies get together, but none of each individual 13 colonies, or what we'll later call states, want to give up their own power. Ohio wants to make, or not Ohio, but Pennsylvania wants to make laws that are best for Pennsylvania, and South Carolina wants to make laws that are best for South Carolina, and so forth. And if you join a union at some level, whether that's a lot or a little bit, you have to give up some of your sovereignty, some of your autonomy, some of your ability to do what you want when you want. And so none of the 13 colonies, later on states, want to do that. And so Ben Franklin comes up with this plan, and then there's a giant head. This would allow create a 13 colony, what we call a federal government now, the United States government, the government in Washington, D.C. This will allow them to collect taxes, raise troops, and regulate trade, but zero out of the 13 colonies were willing to approve the plan. Like I said a minute ago, none of them wanted to give up their own power. And so Franklin was upset. You'll read in the book on Monday that he was like, everybody says we need a union, but when it comes time to make one, they can't focus long enough to do it. Kids these days, because he was an old man, but people have been complaining about kids these days since the times of like Aristotle and Plato, so it's nothing new. But so Franklin was upset. The French and Indian War is about to start. That's section 4. Again, sorry for the spoiler. And so that's it for today. So make sure you're writing these down. Make sure you are, if you're going out, washing your hands, keeping your mask on, staying away from people if possible, and take care of yourself. And have a good weekend. And I will see you on Monday.